And meanwhile, not to exclude the men, there's also something called a crisis of masculinity, according to Susan Faludi, who says that some groups of men are still confident in their gender roles and they still feel in control, but in a way, perhaps because they feel threatened by the rise of feminism, there are also some groups of men who find themselves marginalized and lacking in self-respect. So this is in turn related to the crisis in education, where there's a crisis of masculinity because for some men, those who feel threatened by these social changes, like women being equal to them, and also there are also social changes or technological changes in the nature of work. Like again, if we recall the Marxian perspective of social change based on the mode of production, and with technology moving more towards IT, and as we know now, the fourth industrial revolution, perhaps there is a kind of digital divide as well. So that could be one of the reasons why we see more women than men in education. So with that said, there is also the connection between gender and sexuality. While gender is the social roles or the set of expectations that we are expected to perform through society, sexual orientation or sexuality would be the kind of people that we are attracted to. And this is tend to be pegged based on our gender as well. For example, most of society expects individuals to be heterosexual. That is to say, men must be interested in women and women must be interested in men. And this is because from the structural functionalist point of view, this will enable and encourage reproduction. That is to say, more babies will be born to replace those who have been deceased in society. So in a way, through capitalism, we'll always have a decent-sized workforce. So within hegemonic masculinity, it's called that because there's a construct of what it takes to be masculine. So when we say the word masculine, what comes to mind? Usually we can break it down to several characteristics like, for example, being strong, being unemotional, being instrumental, being aggressive, perhaps, being, being active, and so on and so forth. So this is a set of expectations that is placed upon the individual, and it can be quite hegemonic, or in a way it's like pressure is being put upon the individual to inhabit all of these attributes. And if you don't inhabit any of these attributes, society will consider you as weak or not masculine. So for a man, it's viewed by society as a failure, especially if society is very oppressive or very structural functionalist. And it seems that most of the time, most societies don't tolerate any deviation from the norm. So anyway, this particular theory or concept, hegemonic masculinity, was conceptualized by Bob Cornell. And of course, it could be taken to an extreme when you see examples of bullying, where sometimes boys in a large group are expected to be tough to the point that they bully those who are weak. And those who don't want to take part are also pressured into doing so. Otherwise, it's their turn to be bullied. So Bob Cornell is now known as Raewyn Cornell, and they are a very well-known gender theorist, but not to exclude their previous publication name, which was Bob or Robert Cornell. So sociological approaches to gender argue that we must challenge the interplay of sex, gender, and sexuality as though it's a given or naturally occurring and unchanging phenomena, which one may also call biologically determinist. That is to say, women, for example, are forced into some kind of biological destiny to always be treated as property by men around them. So if we look at the application of these concepts to media studies, we have several interesting concepts like, for example, the male gaze, where if you watch certain movies, especially perhaps older movies from a few decades ago, you might see that sometimes female characters tend to be portrayed as they're always the victim, and the camera always pans slowly to appreciate the curves of their body, and they're just there as to look beautiful as objects, but they're not subjects with their own agency. And it's always the tough guy who comes to the rescue of the weak woman who can't stand up for herself. So there was something called the Bechdel test that was kind of made up by some media theorists who were trying to apply a kind of litmus test to movies or any types of media to see whether it was sexist or not. Sexist means the assumption that one gender or one sex is superior to the other. So it's usually male sexism towards females. So the Bechdel test was meant to see if there are any female characters in a movie, and if there's two or more female characters, do they ever talk about anything else except the male characters? For example, if all they do is talk about their husbands or the other male characters in their family, then it would seem to imply that they have no agency or power over their own lives. So this is not, of course, this entire course is not to make any gender feel bad, and it's not a critique of men or masculinity, but it's a social analysis of how social facts are taken for granted sometimes, as though people are born with the ability to be masculine or feminine, and sometimes it stifles and even oppresses even men themselves, as for example in hegemonic masculinity, where boys are told that boys don't cry. So if you felt very sad over something, you're told to just keep it in and you cannot express yourself. Or else, society or your peers around you, or even education or the media, will negatively sanction you by shaming you, making fun of you, or bullying you. So of course all this leads to something that we call gender inequality, and this refers to the differences in status, power and prestige enjoyed by women and men in various contexts. So for the functionalists, they emphasize that gender differences and the sexual division of labor contribute to social stability and to integration. Of course, for the feminists, they tend to take a social conflict approach, which is in a way inheriting Marx's point of view, but applying it to gender rather than social class. And they reject the idea that gender inequality is natural. So across the entire spectrum of feminism, you have liberal feminists all the way to radical feminists. And for the liberal feminists, they explain gender inequality in terms of social and cultural attitudes like sexism and discrimination, which are attitudes that are ingrained through socialization. For example, when you have households where the parents always tell the girls to do all the household chores and the boys don't have to do anything at all, then that's how socialization happens with norms and values. And on the other hand, radical feminists, they take a more radical stance, of course, and they argue that men are responsible for the exploitation of women through patriarchy. And it's the systematic domination of females by males. And because they're called radical, they try to overturn the existing social order by saying that everything, including marriage itself, is quite oppressive, because the fact that women are the ones who will be pregnant and therefore give birth and are therefore linked to childcare. So if you see a couple that's both working, there's always going to be this issue of, if someone has to put their career on hold for childcare, who should it be? So that's one of the most difficult and interesting questions that arises when talking about heterosexual marriages. And we also have the term gender relations, which refer to societally patterned interactions between men and women in society. And some sociologists have argued that a gender order exists in which expressions of masculinity and femininity are organized in a hierarchy that promotes the domination of men over women. So in the past, it was totally okay to joke like, oh, you run like a girl, and stuff like that. You play baseball like a girl. So it's like saying like a girl means something bad. But saying like you run like a boy isn't a bad thing. So that's the kind of thing where there's a stereotype. So fortunately, if you look at even the evolution of Disney movies, in the past it tended to also play by these gender roles. But if you look at maybe the latest few Disney movies in the past 5 years or so, there are more female characters who are the hero of their own stories, and they tend to go on adventures, not being themselves in distress waiting for the Prince Charming to rescue them, but they themselves become the agents of their own destiny. Now, for most of these stereotypes, according to about gender, they tend to be found in industrial societies, most interestingly. So if you take a Marxist standpoint or a Marxist feminist standpoint, they trace this. The reason is that if you go all the way back to the first industrial revolution, when all these families moved from the rural areas to cities in search of jobs, which is what Durkheim, Comte, and Marx studied, and also Weber, they also brought with them huge families in which they had to divide their labor, where the men go out to do hard labor, like mining, working in factories, backbreaking labor. So of course there needed to be someone who stayed at home. And so usually there was the wives who were also mothers and who were involved in childcare. But if we look at some perhaps non-industrial societies, like the Jambuli culture of New Guinea, you would see quite a difference in terms of gender roles, where women did things like fishing, manufacturing, and it's also kind of matrilineal or matriarchal, where they also control the power and economic life of the community. So like property passes down through the mother side. And Jambuli